185,000 soldiers were faced, but none prevailed. Today, let's explore one of the most impressive biblical narratives, highlighting God's sovereign intervention in the destinies of his people. This is the story of King Hezekiah and his struggle against countless adversaries, a tale of faith and miracles that transcends generations. In stark contrast to his father Ahaz, known for his nefarious acts, Hezekiah emerged as a figure of virtue and devotion during his 29-year reign in Jerusalem. From a young age, at 25, he dedicated himself to following divine precepts, walking in righteousness, just like his predecessor, King David. His mother, Abi, daughter of Zechariah, deeply influenced his path. During his reign, Hezekiah made bold decisions that profoundly reformed religious practice in Judah. He abolished the high places of worship, shattered the Asherah poles, and destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made because the people had begun to idolize it, contrary to God's commandments. This act symbolized not only the purification of faith, but also reaffirmed his commitment to divine precepts. His government was marked not only by fidelity to divine will, but also by prosperity and peace, testifying that the Lord was with him. Amid kings who deviated and committed atrocities, Hezekiah stood out as a beacon of hope and righteousness. During his reign, Hezekiah distinguished himself not only for his religious devotion, but also for his courage and political acumen. In a bold break with the past, he rebelled against the powerful kingdom of Assyria, rejecting its submission and facing the consequences of his decision with determination. He strengthened Judah, defeated the Philistines, and expanded the territory to Gaza, reaffirming his sovereignty. However, the challenges were immense. In the 7th year of his reign, the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, marched against Samaria, capturing it after a 3-year siege. This conquest posed a direct threat to the kingdom of Judah, as Assyria proved to be a relentless adversary. In response to their continued aggression, Hezekiah attempted a diplomatic approach, acknowledging his errors and offering tribute to avoid a direct attack on Jerusalem. Despite his effort to preserve peace, the price was high. Hezekiah was forced to strip the temple of the Lord and the royal treasury to meet Assyrian demands. This phase of his reign illustrates not only the constant tension with Assyrian forces, but also the complexity of decisions a leader must face in times of crisis. Hezekiah, despite the adversities, remained faithful to his principles, always seeking divine protection and the well-being of his people. Despite all of Hezekiah's efforts and concessions, the situation in Judah rapidly deteriorated. Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, was not satisfied with the offered tribute and continued to advance, conquering all the fortified cities of Judah except Jerusalem. At this critical point, the holy city found itself isolated and under imminent threat of siege. Hezekiah, in a moment of desperation and an attempt to protect Jerusalem, admitted failures in his previous strategies and proposed to pay whatever was necessary to ensure the safety of his people. Despite already having stripped the temple and palace of their riches to pay the initial ransom, Sennacherib's insatiable greed led him to demand even larger sums. Confronted with an overwhelming military force, Hezekiah was once again forced to sacrifice the wealth of his kingdom, even dismantling the precious gold coverings of the temple doors to satisfy Assyrian demands. Meanwhile, a large Assyrian delegation, led by important generals, arrived at Jerusalem's gates, strategically positioning themselves at the aqueduct of the Upper Pool, a vital location for the city's water supply. Hezekiah's representatives, led by Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, met the Assyrians, facing one of the most tense and decisive moments of Hezekiah's reign. The city, surrounded and pressured, now depended not only on the diplomatic skill of its leaders, but also on a divine miracle to avoid its fall. In front of Jerusalem's gates, the Assyrian spokesperson, the Rabshakeh, launched a bold and intimidating challenge directly at Hezekiah. With a voice loaded with provocation, he questioned the basis of Hezekiah's confidence, mocking his alliance with Egypt, which he described as weak and treacherous. He also questioned Hezekiah's faith in the Lord, insinuating that by destroying the high places and altars, the king had alienated his own God. The Rabshakeh then issued a provocative challenge, offering horses to Hezekiah in an attempt to highlight the insufficiency of Judah's forces compared to the powerful Assyrian army. With calculated audacity, he claimed that it was the God of Israel himself who sent him to destroy the land, a falsehood intended to sow doubt and fear among the people of Jerusalem. The Rabshakeh's words were designed to demoralize and make the city's inhabitants feel isolated and hopeless, especially since the powerful northern neighbors had already succumbed to Assyrian forces. This psychological manipulation aimed to break Jerusalem's resistance through doubt and fear, testing Hezekiah's faith and the loyalty of his people to the limit. In the face of rising tension, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah sought to handle the negotiations in a way that would minimize the impact of the Assyrian words on the people. They asked the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, a language understood by the leaders but not by the majority of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who were listening attentively from the top of the walls. However, disdainfully ignoring this request, the Rabshakeh deliberately chose Hebrew to communicate his threatening and humiliating message, highlighting the extreme vulnerability they would be subject to if they resisted. He addressed the crowd in Hebrew, amplifying his threats and mocking Hezekiah's promises of divine protection. With brutal honesty, he proclaimed that no intervention by Hezekiah or the God of Israel could save the people of Jerusalem from the hands of the king of Assyria. Instead, he offered an apparently merciful choice: surrender, promising life and prosperity in exchange for loyalty to the Assyrian king. The promise of living in peace in their own lands until they were taken to a new land, a land of grain and new wine, was a strategy to seduce the people of Jerusalem, putting them at an emotional and spiritual crossroads. Would it be fear or faith that would guide them in this moment of despair? With this cunning proposal, the Rabshakeh not only tested the loyalty of the inhabitants of Jerusalem to Hezekiah and their faith in the Lord, but also sought to sow disunity and despair among them. The offer of peace and prosperity made by the Assyrian spokesman echoed sinisterly through the walls of Jerusalem, bringing a painful temptation to its besieged inhabitants. The promise of a fertile and safe land in exchange for surrender mirrored the oldest biblical temptations, where grand promises often concealed great dangers and deviations from faith. Continuing his psychological campaign, the Rabshakeh cast doubt on the power of the God of Israel, unfavorably comparing him with the gods of other nations who had failed to protect their people from Assyrian hands. His rhetorical questions sought to undermine the confidence of the inhabitants of Jerusalem in divine protection, proclaiming the inevitability of Assyrian victory and suggesting that even the Lord could not deliver Jerusalem from their hands. In the face of these provocations, the people, obeying King Hezekiah's order not to respond, maintained a tense silence. Hezekiah's representatives, deeply disturbed by the blasphemies they heard, returned to the king with their clothes torn, a sign of mourning and deep despair. Upon receiving the news, Hezekiah, moved by a mix of anguish and faith, tore his own clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sought refuge in the house of the Lord. He then sent his emissaries to the prophet Isaiah, seeking divine guidance and intercession. They conveyed to Isaiah the grave situation and the hope that the Rabshakeh's insulting words would be repudiated by God himself, imploring for a prayer for the remnant that still resisted in the city. This critical moment highlights not only the political and military crisis, but also a profound spiritual crisis, where faith would be the last stronghold against despair. At the height of his anguish and despair, King Hezekiah turned to the place that symbolized divine presence and protection, the temple of the Lord. He tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth, gestures of mourning and penitence deeply rooted in his faith. In the midst of the crisis, Hezekiah not only sought refuge in worship, but also sought divine wisdom through the prophet Isaiah, sending a delegation to express the gravity of the situation. Isaiah's response was immediate and assertive, bringing a message of hope and firmness. "Do not be afraid of the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed against me." Isaiah assured that God was aware of the blasphemies and had a plan to reverse the situation. He prophesied that the Assyrian chief, upon hearing certain news, would be compelled to return to his country, where he would face his own tragic end by the sword. This episode underscores the recurring biblical promise, "Do not fear." The narrative emphasizes that even in the darkest moments, God's presence remains with those who keep their faith. Trust in God not only provides peace amidst chaos, but also assures that He is actively involved in the unfolding of His faithful's lives. With the war still raging around and the Assyrian threat persisting, Isaiah's words brought a new dimension to the conflict. A battle not just for territories, but also a spiritual war where faith would be decisive. Despite the challenging circumstances, Hezekiah now had a glimpse of hope, sustained by the divine promise of salvation and justice. As the conflict continued, the Assyrian spokesman Rabshakeh did not remain idle. Receiving news of significant military movements, he learned that the Assyrian king had shifted his focus from Jerusalem to face a new threat from Cush at Libnah. Despite this temporary distraction, Rabshakeh made sure to reiterate his threats to Hezekiah, reminding him of the terrible destructions the Assyrians had inflicted on other nations and questioning the power of the God of Israel against the backdrop of Assyrian conquests. In response to this persistent provocation, Hezekiah took a step of profound faith and reverence. Receiving the letter from the messengers, he did not succumb to despair, but went up to the house of the Lord and spread the letter before God, seeking divine intervention in a solemn and respectful manner. Hezekiah prayed fervently, acknowledging God's supremacy over all created things and appealing for him to show the world that only the Lord is God. Hezekiah's prayer was an act of unwavering faith and a demonstration of his complete reliance on divine power. He highlighted the impotence of the idols worshipped by the nations subdued by Assyria, contrasting them with the living and true God, creator of heaven and earth. Hezekiah implored God to save Jerusalem, not only to preserve his people, but so that all the kingdoms of the earth might recognize his glory and sovereignty. This passage illustrates Hezekiah's conviction that divine intervention was essential not only for the physical survival of his people, but also to affirm God's honor before the nations. Hezekiah's prayer serves as a powerful example of how faith can be exercised in moments of crisis, seeking not only relief from suffering, but the vindication of God's character before an observing world. In response to Hezekiah's fervent prayer, God spoke through Isaiah, sending a powerful and challenging message to the Assyrian king Rabshakeh. In this divine pronouncement, the city of Jerusalem is personified as the virgin daughter of Zion, mocking and scorning the Assyrian king, a symbol of Judah's spiritual and moral resistance against the arrogance and blasphemy of its enemies. God directly questions Rabshakeh, "Whom have you insulted and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel." This divine rhetoric underscores the gravity of challenging not just a nation, but God himself. Isaiah describes how Rabshakeh boasted of his military and geographical conquests, claiming to have reached the remotest places and completely dominated natural forces as if by his own power. However, the divine revelation clarifies that all of Rabshakeh's successes were, in fact, part of a greater plan ordained by God long ago, demonstrating that the Assyrian king was merely an instrument in the hands of the God of Israel. The message concludes with the symbolic threat that just as Rabshakeh came, he would be forced to return. God would put a hook in his nose, a way of saying that Rabshakeh would be controlled and led back to his land against his will, like a captured animal. This response not only reaffirms God's sovereign control over world events, but also serves as a reminder of God's power to protect his people and humiliate those who challenge his authority. The divine response is a powerful declaration that despite appearances, human power is limited and ultimately subjected to divine will. At the climax of this epic narrative, God provides a sign of hope and renewal for Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem, besieged and threatened. The divine sign promises that despite the siege and famine, they will have sustenance. In the first year, they will eat what grows naturally. In the second, what sprouts from these plants. And in the third year, they will plant and harvest with their own hands. This promise symbolizes the resilience and recovery of Judah, affirming that a remnant will survive, thrive, and multiply, emerging from Jerusalem with new life and strength. God then categorically declares that the Assyrian king Rabshakeh will not conquer Jerusalem. He will not enter the city, nor will he shoot an arrow, come close with shields, or build a siege ramp against it. Instead, he will return by the way he came. This promise of God's defense of Jerusalem is doubly grounded for his own honor and for the love of David, whose lineage he promised to preserve, a promise that would extend to the advent of Jesus Christ. The divine intervention culminates dramatically. That very night, an angel of the Lord descends upon the Assyrian camp and kills 185,000 soldiers, leaving a trail of death that forces Rabshakeh to retreat. In an ironic and final twist, Rabshakeh is assassinated by his own sons while worshipping in his temple, and Esarhaddon, his son, takes the throne. This outcome not only frees Jerusalem from the imminent Assyrian threat, but also reaffirms God's sovereignty over nations and the fates of men, demonstrating his ability to save and judge with unparalleled power. The entire episode is a powerful reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, faithfulness to God can trigger events that transcend human understanding and alter the course of history. The resolution of the Assyrian threat is as dramatic as it is miraculous. With a single divine act, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers fall dead, leaving Rabshakeh not only militarily impotent, but also politically vulnerable. This event echoes the biblical story of David and Goliath, where a giant is felled not by human strength, but by the power of God. Just like Goliath, Rabshakeh challenged the God of Israel and met his end not by human hand, but by divine judgment. The irony of his death, murdered while worshipping in his own temple, underscores the impotence of his gods and the sovereignty of the God of Israel. The destruction of Rabshakeh and his army serves as a powerful reminder that, in the end, it is the Lord who protects and judges, and no earthly power can prevail against divine will. I hope this video has inspired and strengthened your faith in God's sovereignty and protection. Don't forget to like if you appreciated the narrative and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Share this video so others can also be encouraged by these powerful truths. May God bless each of you on your journey of faith.